The morning of March 23, 2009, broke over Tokyo with a sense of unease. The sky was a churning canvas of gray clouds, and the air itself seemed restless. At Narita International Airport, one of the world's busiest hubs, ground crews battled against the elements. The wind was a relentless force, howling across the vast runways with a fierce and unpredictable nature. It was not just a steady blow, it was a tempestuous gale, punctuated by powerful gusts that made even the largest of machines seem vulnerable. Flags whipped violently, and the sound of the wind was a constant low roar that promised a difficult day for any pilot attempting to land. On the ground, air traffic controllers watched their screens with heightened awareness. They knew that these conditions were far from ideal for the delicate ballet of takeoffs and landings. The weather reports were stark and unforgiving. The wind was blowing from 320 degrees at a sustained speed of 28 knots, a significant challenge in itself. But the real danger lay in the gusts, which spiked to an alarming 40 knots. This created a perilous environment known as wind shear, a sudden and drastic change in wind speed or direction over a short distance. For an aircraft on final approach, this phenomenon could be catastrophic, pushing it off course or violently altering its descent rate in the critical moments before touchdown. High above the turbulent surface, FedEx Express Flight 80 was making its final descent. The massive McDonnell Douglas MD-11F cargo plane, registration N526FE, was completing its journey from Guangzhou, China. Inside the expansive cargo hold, millions of dollars worth of goods were securely strapped down, their journey nearly at its end. For the two pilots guiding the heavy aircraft, this was the final leg of a long and demanding duty schedule. They were approaching one of the most challenging landings of their careers, into a storm that was showing no signs of letting up. The lights of Tokyo were beginning to pierce through the gloom below, a beacon that marked both the end of their flight and the beginning of their greatest test. The aircraft shuddered as it descended through the agitated air, a giant metal bird fighting against an invisible, powerful current. Every shake and jolt was a reminder of the forces at play outside the cockpit. The pilots had been briefed on the weather conditions and knew what to expect. But knowing and experiencing are two different things. The MD-11, a powerful and reliable workhorse of the cargo industry, was about to be pushed to its operational limits. The stage was set for a dramatic and ultimately tragic conclusion to what had, until these final minutes, been a routine cargo flight across the skies of Asia. The wind howled, the plane descended, and the world watched, unaware of the impending disaster. At the controls of Flight 80 were two highly experienced aviators, men who had dedicated their lives to the sky. In the captain's seat, acting as the pilot monitoring for this leg of the journey, was 54-year-old Kevin Mosley. Captain Mosley was a seasoned professional with a deep well of experience. Before joining the world of commercial cargo aviation, he had served as a fighter pilot, a role that demands exceptional skill, precision, and the ability to make split-second decisions under immense pressure. His time in the military had honed his instincts and given him a commanding presence in the cockpit. With thousands of flight hours to his name, he was a picture of confidence and competence, a steady hand ready to oversee the landing. In the first officer's seat, handling the physical controls as the pilot flying, was 49-year-old Anthony Pino. Like his captain, First Officer Pino had a distinguished military background, having flown the enormous Lockheed C-5 Galaxy transport aircraft. This experience gave him a profound understanding of how to handle large, heavy planes. However, his time on the MD-11 was comparatively limited. While he had accumulated around 900 hours on the type, a significant portion of that time had been spent as a relief pilot on long-haul flights. This meant his hands-on experience with the most critical phases of flight, takeoff and landing, was not as extensive as his total hours might suggest. A subtle but crucial detail in the events that were about to unfold.
Yeehaw, ride 'em, cowboy!
As the aircraft was buffeted by the turbulent winds on its approach to Narita, a moment of levity was captured by the cockpit voice recorder. Faced with the rocking and shaking of the plane, Captain Mosley, the ex-fighter pilot, was heard to exclaim, "Yeehaw! Ride 'em, cowboy!" It was a small, human moment amidst a high-stakes situation, a glimpse into the calm demeanor of a pilot accustomed to challenging conditions. It suggested a crew that, despite the weather, felt they had the situation under control. They were professionals, working together to bring their aircraft safely to the ground, relying on their training and their trust in one another to navigate the storm. However, beneath the surface of their professional calm, another factor was at play: fatigue. Both pilots had been on a long and grueling duty cycle, flying across multiple time zones. The human body is not designed for such demanding schedules, and the subtle creep of exhaustion can impair judgment and slow reaction times. Although their rest periods had complied with the regulations in place at the time, both men had commented on feeling tired. This hidden fatigue, combined with the challenging weather and the specific handling characteristics of the MD-11, was creating a dangerous cocktail of contributing factors. The two men in the cockpit were skilled, but they were also human, and they were tired. The descent into Narita was anything but smooth. As Flight 80 dropped below 2,000 feet, it entered the most severe zone of wind shear. The aircraft, a behemoth weighing hundreds of thousands of pounds, was tossed about like a small boat in a heavy sea.
All right, holding steady. Runway in sight.
First Officer Pino gripped the controls, his focus absolute as he fought to keep the plane aligned with runway 34 left. The instrument landing system provided a precise electronic path to the runway, but it was up to the pilot to make constant, minute adjustments to counteract the wind's violent pushes and shoves. Every gust was a new battle, demanding an immediate and correct response to keep the wings level and the descent path stable. Captain Mosley, in his role as pilot monitoring, was a crucial second set of eyes and ears.
1,000 feet.
He called out altitudes and airspeeds, cross-checking the instruments and ensuring they remained within the safe operating envelope. His voice was a calm and steady presence in the cockpit, providing vital information so that First Officer Pino could concentrate solely on the task of flying the airplane. The synergy between the two pilots was essential in these final moments. They were a team, working in concert to overcome the adverse conditions. The lights of the runway grew brighter, a long, inviting strip that promised an end to their turbulent journey. The MD-11 is an aircraft known for its unique handling characteristics, especially during landing. It requires a higher-than-average approach speed to maintain stability, and its smaller horizontal stabilizer makes it less forgiving of pilot errors during the flare, the critical maneuver just before touchdown where the pilot raises the nose to slow the rate of descent. Pilots often say the MD-11 has to be flown all the way to the ground. There is no room for complacency. For First Officer Pino, this landing was a test of his familiarity with the aircraft's specific demands, a test made infinitely more difficult by the gusting crosswinds that battered the plane. The cockpit voice recorder captured the intense focus of the crew. The conversation was purely professional, a series of call-outs and acknowledgments.
1,000 feet.
Stable, gear down, flap set.
The checklists were complete. The landing gear was down, and the flaps were set for landing. Everything was proceeding by the book, but the book could not account for the sheer ferocity of the wind on this particular morning. As they passed the final approach fix, the point from which the last, straight-in part of the landing begins, the crew committed to the landing. The runway was in sight, and their full attention was on getting the wheels safely on the pavement. As Flight 80 crossed the threshold of runway 34 left, the moment of truth arrived. The final few feet of a landing are among the most difficult for any pilot, requiring a delicate touch and precise timing. The goal is to perform the flare maneuver at just the right height, gently raising the aircraft's nose to bleed off speed and allow the main landing gear to kiss the pavement softly. On this morning, however, the timing was off.
Flaring, now.
First Officer Pino initiated the flare slightly too late. This small error in judgment meant the aircraft was descending more rapidly than ideal when it met the runway, a situation exacerbated by the powerful and unpredictable winds. The result was not a gentle kiss, but a hard, jarring impact. The right main landing gear struck the concrete with tremendous force, sending a shudder through the entire airframe.
I saw a huge puff of smoke as the wheels hit, much harder than normal.
From the airport control tower, observers saw a puff of white smoke erupt from the tires as they were slammed onto the runway surface. This was not just a firm landing, it was a dangerously hard one. The immense energy of the impact had nowhere to go but back up into the aircraft. Instead of settling onto the runway, the massive MD-11 bounced back into the air, its momentum carrying it upward in an uncontrolled ascent. In the cockpit, the sudden violent bounce was a clear signal that the landing had gone wrong. The carefully controlled descent had been broken, and the pilots were now faced with a new and urgent problem. They were airborne again, but with low airspeed and without the stability of a normal flight.
FedEx 80, we observed a hard landing. Do you require assistance?
In these situations, pilot training dictates a specific set of actions. The recommended procedure for a bounced landing is to apply full power and execute a go-around, climbing away to circle the airport and attempt the landing again under more controlled circumstances. It is a safety maneuver designed to turn a potentially dangerous situation into a safe one. However, in the critical seconds following the first hard bounce, a different decision was made. Instead of advancing the throttles for a go-around, First Officer Pino made a critical input. He pushed the control column forward, attempting to force the aircraft's nose back down and get it onto the runway. This action was likely an instinctive reaction, an attempt to save the landing and correct the bounce without aborting the attempt. It was a decision made in a fraction of a second, under immense pressure, and it would prove to have catastrophic consequences. The aircraft, now responding to the pilot's command, began to pitch nose down toward the runway for a second impact. The aircraft's response to First Officer Pino's nose-down input was swift and, honestly, pretty severe. By pushing the control column forward without simultaneously adding engine power to cushion the descent, he was essentially forcing the nearly 400,000-pound aircraft back onto the ground.
This action caused the plane to land on its nose gear first, a configuration for which it was definitely not designed. The nose gear is, well, the weakest of the three landing gear assemblies, intended primarily for steering on the ground, not for bearing the initial impact of landing.
This second impact was even harder and, more violent than the first. This nose-first contact with the runway initiated a phenomenon known as a porpoise, or a series of severe oscillations. The impact on the nose gear acted like a fulcrum, catapulting the aircraft back into the air with even greater force than the first bounce.
This time, the MD-11 leapt to a height of approximately 16 feet above the runway. It was now completely unstable, pitching violently in the air with dangerously low airspeed.
The situation had escalated from a bad landing to a critical emergency in just a matter of seconds. The pilots were no longer flying the aircraft. They were, in a way, passengers in a machine that was out of control.
From where I was standing, the scene was just horrifying. We watched as the massive cargo jet bounced once, then pitched forward and slammed down onto its nose, only to be launched back into the air in a dramatic, uncontrolled arc. The aircraft's movements looked so unnatural and violent, a clear sign that something had gone terribly wrong in the cockpit.
The pilots were in a desperate struggle, fighting to regain control, but the laws of physics and aerodynamics were now working against them. The porpoising motion was self-sustaining, each impact feeding the next oscillation with more energy.
After reaching the peak of its second, much higher bounce, the aircraft's nose pitched down once more. This time, the descent was final. With insufficient airspeed and no power to arrest the fall, the MD-11 plummeted back towards the runway.
The nose gear, already weakened from the previous impact, was the first to strike the concrete again. But this time, the forces were simply too great.
The aircraft slammed into the ground with catastrophic force. The pilots had lost their battle against the machine and the elements. The violent oscillations had sealed their fate, and the final impact was, unfortunately, imminent. The crash had happened in full view of the control tower and other aircraft on the ground. The shocking and violent sequence of events, from the first bounce to the final, fiery disintegration, had unfolded in less than 30 seconds. For those who witnessed it, it was an unforgettable image of destruction. The primary focus for the emergency crews was the fate of the two pilots trapped inside the inverted cockpit. Tragically, due to the extreme impact forces in the post-crash fire, Captain Kevin Mosley and First Officer Anthony Pino did not survive. The routine cargo flight had ended in a devastating tragedy on the runway at Narita. Firefighters began to coat the burning wreckage with thick layers of foam, desperately trying to suppress the flames and reach the cockpit. But the heat was immense, and the fire was relentless. Airport emergency services responded immediately, dispatching fire trucks and rescue crews to the scene within seconds of the crash. The third and final impact was devastating. The aircraft slammed onto the runway with incredible violence, landing hard on its nose gear once again. The forces involved were far beyond what the structure was designed to withstand. The left main landing gear, which had already been subjected to extreme stress, collapsed under the immense load. This failure caused the left wing to drop and violently strike the runway surface. The wing, filled with thousands of pounds of jet fuel, scraped along the abrasive concrete at high speed. The friction generated sparks, which instantly ignited the fuel pouring from the ruptured wing tanks. A massive fireball erupted from the left side of the aircraft, engulfing the wing and fuselage in flames. The plane, now critically damaged and unbalanced, veered sharply to the left. The momentum carried it forward, but it was no longer a controlled landing roll. It was a horrifying, uncontrolled skid. The structural integrity of the airframe gave way completely. The fuselage broke apart, and the aircraft began to flip over onto its back. It tumbled across the runway in a fiery, grinding cartwheel, shedding debris and spewing flames as it went. The massive MD-11 finally came to rest upside down, just off the side of runway 34 left. It was a mangled, unrecognizable wreck, completely engulfed in a raging inferno. The intense fire was fed by the jet fuel from the ruptured tanks, creating a black plume of smoke that could be seen for miles. In the aftermath of the tragedy, the responsibility of discovering what went wrong fell to the Japan Transport Safety Board, or JTSB. Investigators arrived at the scene while the wreckage was still smoldering.
Their first task was to secure the crash site, documenting the position of every piece of debris and meticulously photographing the scene from every angle. The inverted, charred hulk of the MD-11 told a story of extreme violence. The investigators' job was to read that story, to piece together the final fatal moments of Flight 80 and provide answers to a grieving company and two families who had lost their loved ones.
Two of the most critical pieces of evidence were the aircraft's black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. These devices are designed to withstand incredible impact forces and intense fire, preserving a record of the flight's final moments.
The FDR would provide a precise, second-by-second account of the aircraft's performance, its altitude, airspeed, control inputs, engine power settings, and the state of its various systems. The CVR would offer a window into the human element, capturing every word spoken in the cockpit, every sound of a switch being flipped, and every alarm that might have sounded.
The JTSB team began a systematic process of elimination. They examined the possibility of a mechanical failure with the aircraft itself.
Maintenance records for N526F were scrutinized, showing that the plane had been properly maintained and had no outstanding issues that could have contributed to the crash. Investigators examined the recovered parts of the landing gear, engines, and flight control systems. While the post-crash damage was immense, there was no evidence to suggest that a pre-impact failure of any critical system had occurred. The engines appeared to be responding to commands, and the flight controls were intact until the final impact.
The weather was another major area of focus. The strong, gusty winds and reported wind shear were undeniable factors.
Investigators analyzed meteorological data and airport weather reports to build a complete picture of the atmospheric conditions the pilots were facing. It was clear that the landing was attempted in a very challenging environment. However, thousands of planes land in difficult weather every day around the world. The key question for the JTSB was not just what the conditions were, but how the crew and the aircraft interacted with those conditions.
The answer, they suspected, lay in the crucial data held within the two black boxes. When the data from the flight data recorder was successfully extracted, it painted a clear and chilling picture of Flight 80's final seconds. The recorder confirmed the late flare, the high sink rate, and the initial hard touchdown on the right main gear.
Crucially, it then showed First Officer Pino's large nose-down control input immediately after the first bounce. The data revealed that this input was made without any corresponding increase in engine thrust. This was the critical action that initiated the deadly porpoising oscillations.
The FDR showed the aircraft pitching down, striking its nose gear, and then being launched back into the air to a height of 16 feet before the final, fatal impact.
The cockpit voice recorder corroborated the data, revealing a crew that was focused but also under immense stress. The initial yeehaw comment from Captain Mosley indicated an awareness of the turbulence, but there were no verbal calls for a go-around after the first bounce. The sounds captured on the CVR confirmed the sequence of hard impacts.
The investigation concluded that the first officer's reaction to the bounce was contrary to standard procedure. Instead of aborting the landing, he attempted to salvage it, an action that directly led to the loss of control.
The JTSB determined that the probable cause of the accident was the series of porpoising oscillations induced by the pilot's actions.
The investigation also delved deeper into contributing factors. The design of the MD-11 itself was considered. The aircraft's sensitivity during landing was well known in the pilot community. Its high approach speed and less forgiving flight controls meant that there was a smaller margin for error compared to other wide-body jets.
The JTSB noted that this design characteristic, while not a cause in itself, made recovery from a bounced landing more difficult. It created a situation where a small pilot error could quickly escalate into an unrecoverable state, especially under challenging wind conditions.
Finally, the JTSB addressed the issue of pilot fatigue. While the crew's schedule met the regulatory requirements of the time, the investigation acknowledged that both pilots had been on duty for a long period and had commented on being tired.
Fatigue is known to impair cognitive function, slow reaction times, and affect decision-making. While impossible to quantify its exact role, the board concluded that fatigue likely degraded the crew's performance and may have contributed to the decision-making error after the first bounce. It was another layer in a complex chain of events that culminated in tragedy.
The crash of FedEx Flight 80 was a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of aviation. In its wake, the tragedy served as a powerful catalyst for change, prompting a re-evaluation of pilot training, aircraft design, and operational procedures.
The Japan Transport Safety Board issued a series of important safety recommendations aimed at preventing a similar accident from ever happening again. One of the key recommendations was directed at Boeing, urging them to consider modifications to the MD-11's flight control software to provide better protection against the kind of porpoising oscillations that doomed Flight 80.
In response to the crash, FedEx Express took immediate and comprehensive action. The company completely overhauled its flight manuals and pilot training programs, placing a much stronger emphasis on the correct procedures for handling a bounced landing.
The new training protocols stressed that in the event of a significant bounce, the primary and immediate response should be to execute a go-around. The idea of saving a bad landing was actively discouraged.
Simulators were reprogrammed to replicate the exact conditions of the Flight 80 crash, allowing pilots to experience and safely practice recovery from such a scenario, reinforcing the go-around decision as muscle memory.
The accident also cast a spotlight on the issue of pilot fatigue, not just at FedEx, but across the entire aviation industry. While Flight 80's crew was technically compliant with rest rules, the crash highlighted that mere compliance does not always equate to being well rested.
This led to renewed efforts to develop more sophisticated fatigue risk management systems. These systems move beyond simple flight and duty time limits, using scientific principles to model and predict fatigue, allowing airlines to create smarter schedules that better account for circadian rhythms, time zone crossings, and the cumulative effects of long work periods.
The loss of Captain Mosley and First Officer Pino was a profound tragedy, but their final flight left a lasting legacy of improved safety. The lessons learned from the crash of Flight 80 have been integrated into the training of thousands of pilots and have influenced the way airlines manage risk.
The accident underscored the critical importance of adhering to standard operating procedures, especially under pressure and the need to design aircraft and systems that are more resilient to human error. While the scars of that turbulent morning in Narita remain, the changes made in its aftermath have undoubtedly made the skies safer for everyone.